Bitch, bring me a beer. It's not cold. You didn't hear me? I'm calling your name. This is what women lack. They only work to serve the husband.
What was your emergency?
I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to.
Ma'am, please relax.
All rise.
You may all be seated. Today, November 2nd, we have Bertha Pink. She has been charged with murder on her husband, Michael Pink. Please swear by.
All rise. Swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
I swear to tell the truth, nothing but the truth.
You may be seated.
Mrs. Pink, is there anything you would like to contribute?
I wasn't thinking straight. He was suffocating me. I did it out of self-defense. He was mistreating me for years and I kept crying because I thought he was gonna do something to me.
We will close this session with a 5-year sentence for murder of Michael Pink and a year of probation. The jury agrees 5 years in jail as well as probation with supervision.
Some good stuff, huh?
I've had better.
What? Are you stupid? I wasted all my money on this. You can at least appreciate it.
Because I finally have the chance to kill him.
Give me a drink.
What happened to the neighbors? Ugh, it smells nasty. Oh my god! All rise. You may all be seated. Today, November 14th, we have Pancha Garcia. She has been charged with murder, homicide of her husband, Ivan Garcia. Please swear by. All rise. You swear to tell the truth, nothing but the truth.
I swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
You may sit. Mrs. Garcia, is there anything you would like to contribute?
I didn't kill him. I got set up. I love him.
Ms. Garcia, we have physical evidence that you killed your husband. You will be sentenced to life in prison until further information. You are guilty of the murder of your husband.
Sentencing usually takes place almost immediately after convictions for minor infractions and misdemeanors, or often a defendant has pleaded guilty. A judge will consider several factors in determining a criminal sentence, including whether the offender was under great personal stress or duress when he or she committed the crime, whether the offender was particularly cruel to a victim or particularly destructive.
Trial courts consider evidence presented in a case and make judgments based on facts. 6.5% of female offenders were sentenced for an offense involving weapons, compared to 10.3% of male offenders. The average sentence for a female offender was 29 months compared to 49 months for a male offender.
Facts about sentencing in courts is that colored people get longer sentencing than white people. Any criminal history is not used against the sentence given. Women get shorter sentencings. And in 1985, the federal government developed national sentencing for its courts. This was only based on looking into other cases that were similar to the criminal and receiving the same punishment. 1,067 sexual abuse offenders were sentenced in the federal system. Sexual abuse offenses have increased 5.7% since the year 2014, but it decreased 2.7% in the year 2018. 98.8% of sexual abuse offenders were sentenced to prison, and their average sentence was 16 years. In the year 2018, there were 6,719 offenders convicted under 18 for possession of firearms. The number of offenders sentenced under the statute has increased from 5,498 to 6,719. 97.6% of felon in possession of firearm offenders were sentenced to prison. In the year 2018, there were 1,691 robbery offenders sentenced under the guidelines. The number of robbery offenders has decreased by 2.9% since 2014. The average sentencing is 107 months. Of the 69,425 offenders sentenced in the year 2018, 18,964 offenders were sentenced for drug trafficking offenses. The average sentence for drug trafficking offenders was 76 months, but varied by the drug type.
A charge of first-degree murder is not without defenses. A defendant can argue that they did not commit the crime in questioning. The police simply just has the wrong person. The defendant can also argue that they did commit the crime, but they were justified in doing so because of circumstances or a legal justification. A defendant can argue that they are not guilty of first-degree murder because one or more of the specific elements of the crime has not met. In first-degree murder cases, as well as other homicide crimes, defendants often argue mistaken identity, that the prosecution has charged the wrong person with the crime. Homicide is not always a crime, such as in cases of self-defense or the state-sanctioned execution of certain convicted criminals.
Sentencing usually takes place almost immediately after convictions for minor infractions and misdemeanors, or when a defendant has pleaded guilty in more complex criminal cases, such as those involving serious felonies. The sentencing judge usually receives input for the prosecutor, the defense, and the probation department, which prepares recommendations in a pre-sentence report. A judge will consider several factors in determining a criminal case. Whether the offender has any criminal history, whether the offender was the main offender or an accessory, someone who assists the main offender, or whether the offender was under great personal stress or duress when he or she committed the crime. Whether anyone was injured or the crime was particularly likely to result in injury. Whether the offender was particularly cruel to a victim or particularly destructive. Options in some cases. There are federal and state laws
that provide for mandatory sentences. These laws require judges to impose identical sentences on all persons convicted of the same offense. Mandatory sentences reflect the efforts of state legislatures and Congress to address public concerns regarding judges' leniency or inconsistency in criminal sentencing. The most notable mandatory sentencing laws are the three strikes statutes, which provide for life in prison if a convicted felon has convicted of a serious violent felony and has two or more previous convictions, one of which is another serious violent felony. While these laws have been criticized for being disproportionately harsh, most have been upheld as constitutional.
So the judge does have the responsibility to give an appropriate time for the inmate or the defendant to serve. The number of federal mandatory sentencing has doubled in the last 20 years. A felony carries the 10-year sentencing. Some cases do have exceptions. So how does a sentence in a court happen? First, the defendant pleads guilty or is convicted. It is up to the judge to decide an appropriate punishment during the sentencing phase. He or she can also increase or reduce the sentence depending on how the inmate is doing. So if he's not doing so well, he would either increase it, but if he's doing good, maybe there might be a chance he can decrease it. It is all up to the judge. So there are different sentencings in court. So a original sentencing is where the board paroles a inmate and serves time in the community. For example, admitting that you're driving under the influence in court, or you're either convicted. Aggregate sentence, it can be 2 or more consecutive combined. An aggregate sentence can be 2 or more consecutive sentencings combined and served differently. Example, so you kidnap someone but you also rape them, that's 2 different, and the judge can combine them together, and that would probably make a bigger sentence, which it should. Concurrent sentence is a sentence being served all at one time. So you're being charged with 2 different crimes, or 3 or more, and you're serving them all at the same time. So let's say you serve 2 years and then you serve 3 years. That would be 5 years, but it would minimize to 3 years since you're serving 2 at a time. Consecutive sentence are sentencings following another. So for example, serving one sentence and then the next one follows, so you serve 3 years and then you serve another 3 years, so that's 6 years in total. So that one's kind of similar to aggregate sentence, but aggregate sentence seems a little longer. So how is the length of a sentence determined? And these are 2 of them. I think there's 3, but I'm writing 2. Obviously it's up to the judge, but a mandatory sentence, it cannot have exceptions due to the statute. And the minimum sentence is where an inmate serves the minimum time in order to get parole. So when sentencing in a court happens, they must follow guidelines, but juveniles have an exception just because they do have the opportunity to grow out of the disaster they do, just because teenagers do dumb stuff they're not supposed to.